We have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center.
Hi, I'm Christy Johnson. 9/11 was the Pearl Harbor of my day. These events became a major turning point in my life. Like most Americans, I was stunned. How could a superpower be attacked like this with no resistance? The government told us we were being attacked because of our freedoms. Something just didn't seem right. There had to be more to it than this. So I decided to ask others what they thought.
My definition of a superpower is a power that has no rivals, that can wield its influence at will, that can impose its own policy, its own hegemony at will, can go where it wants to go and not worry about the consequences. We are that superpower.
The United States emerged from the cinders of World War II with its industrial base still intact and the only country with the atomic bomb. It was without question the most powerful nation on earth. What was done with this unprecedented power, the effects it had on our republic and the rest of the world, is the story of superpower. President Truman said, "The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know." Well, I wanted to know more. Why are we the only remaining superpower? Did U.S. foreign policy and military actions factor into this attack on 9/11? Immediately after World War II, the United States began influencing and intervening in foreign governments to an extent and in a manner unparalleled in history. The National Security Act of 1947 fundamentally changed and reorganized the United States military establishments, created the National Security Council, and has since been used as the pretext for the extra constitutional powers in the name of national security. Passed in a time of fear during the Cold War, the National Security Act also created the CIA as an intelligence gathering agency, but almost immediately the CIA expanded into a clandestine operations agency.
The CIA's template for regime change was when Arbenz was overthrown in Guatemala in the early 50s.
The United Fruit Company was in danger of losing a substantial amount of its lands in Guatemala. This was an overthrow of a democratically elected government, and it was because of the economic interest involved, not because of democracy.
We leverage the politics, the decisions, and the economies of many, many countries.
The flip side of that, the failures have far outweighed the successes. CIA overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, Operation Ajax, the infamous case where a freely elected, democratically elected government dared to nationalize the oil. What it really came down to was ideology and economic supremacy and imperialism and U.S. hegemony.
Interventions called for a buildup of U.S. political, economic, and military strength by seeking control over world resources and access to raw materials, markets, and labor power in third world countries. Interventions in foreign governments became common practice. Claimed to be for reasons of national security, these interventions were often solely for the benefit of U.S.-backed multinational corporations.
The U.S. supports democracy if and only if it accords with strategic and economic objectives.
So many Americans are not aware of. We have a very tawdry foreign policy history.
What we were doing was overthrowing a freely democratically elected government because they dared to go against our economic interests.
Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address warned us to safeguard our liberties.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process.
Many people don't realize that the U.S. was involved in Vietnam prior to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
In 1962, when John F. Kennedy launched the invasion of South Vietnam, an event which has disappeared from history. This was after 7 years of supporting a brutal, vicious dictatorship in South Vietnam. Kennedy was at a point of making a decision in 1961, Kennedy, McNamara, and others, and they essentially decided to basically invade. The U.S. Air Force began bombing with South Vietnamese markings, so wouldn't look like the U.S. Air Force, but everybody knew. Authorized napalm, initiated programs of chemical warfare, crop destruction, destroying foliage, and also initiated programs of what, if anybody else did it, we would call ethnic cleansing, driving ultimately millions of people out of the countryside to, again, what if anybody else did it, we would call concentration camps, call them strategic hamlets, or into the urban slums and so on, just in order to undermine the basis for the indigenous resistance. If anybody else did this, we would call it aggression. It happened in the United States without a flicker.
Our policy of regime change has made other countries concerned about the goals of United States policy.
But the U.S. government has been overthrowing governments all over the world for quite a few years, especially in Latin America.
A case that we do know very well about, which is Chile in the early 70s. And Salvador Allende, again, freely elected, democratic elected. Chile had the region's strongest, oldest democracy going back to the 70s. Allende nationalizes the copper interests, and the Americans immediately respond with hostility, embargoes. On September 11th, as a matter of fact, 1973 is when Allende was overthrown, actually killed. Here we have a democratic government being overthrown by a CIA coup.
I could see what we were espousing to do in El Salvador, Nicaragua, other places in the region. And then I could see what was taking place because I was one of those making it take place. Here is the public political pronouncement. Here is what we do. And they don't reconcile. You can't line them up. It's, well, if we say this, but we're doing this. We say we're bringing democracy, but what we're doing is we're enforcing the rule of the oligarchy, the 6 families or the 11 families in El Salvador, and we're slaughtering peasants. And all the peasants want was treat us fairly. That's all we're asking for. Just stop killing us, stop raping us, stop using us as cattle.
Such coups normally don't take place in Latin America except with the okay of Washington.
President Reagan, July 27, 1983.
Yes, we want to underscore once and for all that the United States, along with our friends, seriously opposes the use of force by one neighbor against another in Central America. The United States stands firmly on the side of peace.
Many Cubans were hired to extend the runway at the Grenada airport. U.S. troops invaded to stop this.
October 25, 1983. The U.S. Rapid Deployment Forces hit Grenada. 5,000 Rangers and Marines. By violating all international norms and bringing upon itself the hatred and condemnation of the entire world, the United States demonstrated the level of its complete disregard for the rest of the world.
Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, the invasion of Panama in violation of international law.
The basic lesson is that the U.S. government will not allow an alternative society or government to exist in Latin America. I'm sure the U.S. government has not relaxed its determination to overthrow Chavez in one way or another.
Looking back, people have often said, well, gee, why did you support this dictator? Why did you support that dictator? Well, because there were other interests that we thought were more important.
In the 1980s, we were supporting Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, just to take 3. We could expand that exponentially.
We like puppet governments. What big country wouldn't like a bunch of little friends around the world that do whatever they tell them to do, right?
The United States has not been in a declared war since World War II. Although not classified as war, military conflicts are given euphemisms such as military action, armed response peacekeeping, police action, authorized use of force, military assistance, and military advisors. Regardless of what name is used, the United States has actively been using its military might somewhere in the world for the past 63 years.
We have chosen areas to become involved in where you have internecine warfares going on for generations and generations, which are extremely difficult to deal with. You're not just going to go in and say, okay, fellas, let's change things overnight. We're going to make you, build you into a democracy like we have in America.
It is a sensitive issue. It goes back to this whole notion of, should your culture trump my culture?
The United States asserts its power and military presence through an immense network of foreign military bases.
The 737 number is the official number. These are real military bases. This is American imperialism. It's out of control. One of the things that I study the base structure report every time a new one comes out is to see what they've left out. They've left out the bases in Kosovo. There are no mention of any bases in Afghanistan, 14 permanent bases in Iraq, none of the Central Asian bases. Many of them are omitted because it's too embarrassing to the country to admit that they've allowed American infidels to come in and set up a military base.
The four big ones that we've constructed in Iraq have Pizza Huts and Burger Kings and big BXs and naval PXs. They're really quite the city, quite the American city, very much like the bases we built in Kosovo and Bosnia. These are major permanent installations.
We don't mention any of the bases of any, or many of the espionage and secret bases in the British Isles that are disguised as Royal Air Force bases. There are no Englishmen on these bases, but through administrative agreements we made back at the beginning of the Cold War with Britain, we decided to call them RAF Tipperary Wells or something like that. And it turns out that it's basically a national security agency base for listening into people's telephones and things of this sort. There's a lot of them of that sort. Some of them are truly embarrassing. The big naval base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, where the British High Court has just after 40 years ruled that we and the British took every single inhabitant of Diego Garcia, rounded them up, and transported them to some islands nearby where they have lived in abject poverty and misery ever since. We simply rooted them out of their homes and took them away. This is the way the United States likes to do business, as a matter of armed force. This is our empire.
No foreign forces have set up bases on U.S. soil. This would be inconceivable to the American public. Yet U.S. troops are stationed around the globe, and with this often come problems for the local communities.
Rapes committed by American servicemen leading to court-martial. The rate has been running now since the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, well over 60 years, at 2 a month. It is about as bad public relations as you could conceivably imagine. We claim to have today 38 to 39 big bases. Those are interesting numbers because at the height of the British Empire in 1898, they had about 37. The Romans had about 35 major bases. If you are Dr. No and you really want to rule the world, you need about 35 to 40 really big, unbelievably expensive military bases. It's a way of life. It's militarism.
Since President Eisenhower's farewell address, his warning concerning the dangers of the military-industrial complex have not been heeded, and the problem has grown worse. Today, the military-industrial complex has unequaled influence over our government and military.
What's hard to understand is the failure of the Congress, the failure to exercise the powers of oversight, to use the power of the purse. Dwight Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address, in which he invented the phrase military-industrial complex. We in America actually have a long history of imperialism. What we don't have is a long history of imperialism backed by a huge military establishment. And that's what Eisenhower was talking about. It had grown out of control. If the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, we in America have not been particularly vigilant. It's now so deeply entrenched that there's a very good chance that we will not survive it.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite.
I think it's one of the wisest one in the time of the 20th century. And I think that Eisenhower is judged wrongly in this country. I think he was a very wise president.
Over the years, the Pentagon has become more reliant on outsourcing military functions to private contractors. These contractors have secured very lucrative contracts that not only supply weapons for the military, but provide support services, run military bases, and provide mercenaries. This influence even extends to areas of policy and strategy. Currently, private security contractors are not held accountable in war zones.
We've allowed unauthorized power, unsupervised power, wealth now combined with the military establishment. No military commander in the history of the United States has ever had to deal with the kind of large standing arms industry that we have brought into being since the end of World War II. It has the potential for immense grief for our society.
We're 5% of the world's population. We're close to a third of the world's economic power and more than half of the world's military power.
This idea of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, kind of making its own game plan. Well, guess what? I'm starting to see that with my own eyes.
I think we should go back to what was considered a failed policy in the 20s, which was to be isolationist. I call it restraint, and we should go back to being restrained.
Armed security companies, private military contractors, comprise the second largest force in Iraq, far outnumbering all non-U.S. forces combined. There are as many as 100,000 civilian contractors and approximately 20,000 private security forces.
Then you have all these contractors, favorite bogeymen or real bogeymen would be Halliburton, Bechtel, and the like. And then you have the military-industrial complex, much warned about, and a lot of that's been privatized. So we got a private military in effect.
There's enough private contractors in Iraq now that if you stopped all American official military activities, you'd still have plenty enough people to continue the war if the president truly wanted to do it. They're not counted, they're not recorded, and there is above all no oversight of this extremely lucrative activity.
We spent $22 billion on Iraq reconstruction and relief funds. That's it. Out of that $22 billion, 63% at least went to U.S. multinational companies. And the rest of that was to Iraqi companies that then purchased things from U.S. companies. All that money left Iraq. $2.3 billion went to one company, Bechtel. They like to make a point that they were hiring Iraqis for employment opportunities. Iraqis can rebuild their roads, they can rebuild their dams. Why do we need to hire U.S. companies to rebuild everything that Iraq built in the first place? They have engineers, they have the technical ability, and as far as supporting us, we destroyed their country. During the invasion, we eliminated key infrastructure to demoralize and destabilize the state. We really weren't reconstructing Iraq. We had these middlemen extracting at least 20% for profits, probably much, much more in the average case. And then you also have 20% of every contract for Iraqi reconstruction relief in Iraq goes towards security, which then you bring in the private security contractors.
I think the story of Halliburton weighs purely on decisions of expansion and war and imperialism. This is waking people up to the fact that there is an us and them.
We pay these contractors a significant amount more than we pay soldiers.
Halliburton is a major beneficiary of the war in Iraq. And it's driven by what? Oil. Look at the contract. Look at the first agreement we reached with the Iraqi government was to assure us that we have access to oil. And then how can you justify then that oil is not the driving force? And you look at Somalia, there is nothing, so we abandon it.
I'm not sure if you've heard of the LOGCAT program. It's the Logistics Civilian Augmentation Program. This is the main program that employs contractors in Iraq. The government said, let's see if using contractors is more feasible and more cost-effective than having this huge logistical infrastructure. Who did they hire to do that report? Kellogg Brown and Root. Kellogg Brown and Root, of course, came back and said, it's very cost-effective to use contractors instead of having this huge logistical infrastructure. And you know what? KBR then got the contract later on, of course. The only other company that's ever had a log cap contract is Dynacor. It's an amazing opportunity worth billions of dollars.
Kellogg Brown and Root is a subsidiary of the Halliburton Corporation, of which Dick Cheney used to be the chief executive officer. They charge us $100 a bag to do GI's laundry, and have also prohibited GIs from doing their own laundry. Many of them, which in Iraq, want to do it because Halliburton does such a crappy job. I mean, this stuff comes back smelly and is simply not clean.
Unfortunately, the people that see how the money was spent and the people that see what the end results are don't really speak to each other. So there's never been a full audit all the way through. $3 trillion missing over how many years, who knows, but I'm not surprised.
There is no oversight because these are now private activities of a proprietary firm. The Congress has no authority to demand the record books of these companies, even though all the money comes from taxpayers in contracts for these activities.
So they decide to hire a contractor to do the contract oversight. Lockheed Martin's in the lead right now to go ahead and get that mission of being the fox that guards the hen house. For me, it's completely absurd to have a contract to audit contracts within a contract program.
The defense corporations have made many billions of dollars from the war in Iraq, and that's always on the minds of congressmen who are given bribes by these corporations.
It's simply malpractice, crime, embezzlement, trust violation to have uniformed military officers and executives of the Lockheed Martin Company or the Boeing Aerospace Company stand up in Congress and tell them, we'll have for you in 15 years a national missile defense that can take out, so-called, an incoming threatening missile. We know that it is. They can't do that. They know they can't do that. We're sitting here in the 50th District of California for this interview. Our congressman, now spending 8.5 years in federal prison as the worst bribee in the history of the Congress, was Randy Duke Cunningham. He went out of his way to find military contractors who would bribe him in order to get him to put secret earmarks. Earmarks mean the secret addition to appropriations bills. He was on both the Appropriations Committee and the Intelligence Committee for things that the government didn't ask for, didn't want. It's almost impossible to follow them. He even had a little schedule of what it will cost you in the way of bribes for the amount of federal contract that you will get to build this useless project.
People have got to learn what racketeering has gone on.
The congressmen are complicit in it because they want the money spent for jobs and things of this sort. You have a very strong impression after a while that of course the national missile defense doesn't work. It's too many of the tests have been basically rigged. But that isn't the issue. They don't expect it to work. The important thing about it is that it's expensive.
Budget is power, both in the military, and what a general or an admiral is able to cause Congress to fund whatever weapon system it is or shipbuilding or all that. You know, it's peculiar, you know. The admiral or general retires and the next thing we see he's a VP for.
But the practice is being scrutinized since former Air Force weapons buyer Darlene Druyan pleaded guilty to giving Boeing Company special treatment on a contract for 767 tankers at the same time she was negotiating with Boeing about a potential job.
It's more important to put $1 in his pocket than what's good for the nation. Ultimately, that's real treason.
The only reason we had a massive military was to combat this, what we thought was a massive Soviet threat, which in fact wasn't, but okay, so that's over with. So you would have expected to see huge reductions in Cold War weapon systems, but not a single old weapon system died, okay? And I'm looking at it from my perspective. Guys in the Vietnam era saw the same thing from World War II weapons. No weapon systems are ever shut off.
The United States has retained the character of an institutionalized war economy directed by corporate executives in collusion with the military industry. Even in peacetime, the American military expenditure has remained large, fusing the lines between militarism and war profiteering in what has become a permanently subsidized industry, better known as war corporatism.
They have been forever inventing threats of attacks against us by people using ICBMs, satellites presumably, based in outer space that can be used to attack the Earth. Full spectrum dominance, as the Air Force rather obscenely likes to talk about what we're trying to exercise over the world. We see this disaster of our unilateral, belligerent foreign policy today, of pushing up against the erstwhile superpower, the Soviet Union, now Russia, pushing up against it by expanding NATO bases up to its borders, bringing former satellites into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and now the threat of putting national missile defense sites, rockets such as those at Fort Greely, or there's a few of them at Vandenberg Air Force Base here in California, putting them in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and claiming that they are a defense against a rogue state, Iran, which doesn't have missiles of this sort, and certainly does not have any form of nuclear weapon yet, and certainly not a nuclear weapon that's engineered down enough, small enough to be put on the top of an ICBM. The whole thing it's crazy and should not be tolerated. We want to know, where are the members of Congress? Why is this stuff routinely approved every year without any intelligent debate? Do the people really think that they are more secure to have these missiles buried in Alaska that have never once worked properly? Sakharov, the Nobel Prize winner, explained to Russia back in the last days of the Soviet Union, there's no difficulty in defeating Ronald Reagan's Star Wars.
Clinton, frankly, was maybe not as bad as Bush, but he was bad. And Kosovo, that was an unnecessary manufactured war in the Balkans. The Kosovo War did not have to happen. This was about justifying the necessity of NATO.
There have been multiple protests of U.S. bombing of Yugoslavia, but we also saw in front of the Parliament building, they burned American flags. The police are everywhere.
NATO is an anachronism. It's a Cold War organization. There's no reason for NATO anymore. And that war was all about giving NATO a reason to exist and to continue existing. And in fact, it has not only continued to exist, it has expanded. And in fact, that war coincided with the expansion of NATO into Poland, the Czech Republic, and Bulgaria, as I recall, was the third at the time. And what expansion means, by the way, is before you can join NATO, you have to bring your military forces up to a minimal level of readiness, which means, of course, you have to expand your military, you have to buy all sorts of new weaponry. Well, guess who they have to buy that weaponry from? Primarily the United States, also Great Britain, France to a lesser degree. It's part of this whole monstrosity known as the military-industrial defense complex.
In December 2001, under Bush, the United States officially withdrew from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty signed under Nixon, undermining the landmark agreement. This was the first time in the nuclear era that the U.S. renounced a major arms control accord. The United States has become the greatest manufacturer and distributor of weapons in the world. The drive to sell U.S. weapons is now led by the defense contractors themselves, which sets an extremely dangerous precedent. War corporatism is a self-perpetuating system. Should corporate America be setting U.S. defense policy?
We use our special forces in numerous countries around the world, allegedly for military training, but also as salesmen for our weapons. They're there to try and get some poor country to buy some airplanes they don't need.
U.S. foreign aid is principally military aid. We export weaponry, and we don't give it away, we sell it. It's a huge money maker, you know. My belief is the U.S. military is kept now at a small critical mass, just sufficient to absorb weapon sales. And look at the price of weaponry, my God. And it gets down to this, when I look at it, who are our enemies? Who are our natural enemies? We have none. They don't exist.
We don't manufacture very much of much importance anymore, except for weapons and munitions, of which we are easily the world's largest producer.
Think back to the 80s, the Iran-Iraq war. 8-9 years of that. We're actually supplying both sides because as Kissinger famously said, you know, best outcome for this is if both sides lose.
We fund the two parties and allow them to kill themselves. And then we come out smelling like a rose. In Pakistan, we did it. The Afghanistan situation, we created a mess. We created the Taliban. The Iraqi-Iranian war, we funded Iraq against Iran. We even urged Saddam Hussein to invade Iran. We create this problem. You go to Namibia, go to Angola. We funded UNITA, an organization that fought the legitimate government because we perceived the legitimate government to be Marxist.
We're helping both sides. Certainly we have some knowledge of how our ally is using weapons that we might have given them.
AK-47, M16s are everywhere. Africans do not produce those weapons, and yet they're killing themselves. So yes, CIA or KGB or any of these secret organizations have been known for funding and supporting both sides.
We reawakened the Civil War by the CIA supplying huge amounts of money to the northern warlords and saying, we're going to give you one thing to help you out, our Air Force.
I don't want our people in the middle of a civil war.
The Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, etc., are creations of the U.S. intelligence services and others, Western intelligence services. Remember, they were concocted to defeat the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So, and the ISI actually is a creation of the CIA.
We also had a long history of working with the Taliban because we wanted to build gas and petroleum pipelines across Afghanistan.
You want to judge U.S. foreign policy, look no further than Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is a creation of U.S. foreign policy, actively recruited by the CIA, brought into Afghanistan as part of the Arab faction of the Mujahideen.
We were starving the Muslim children through sanctions against Iraq. There were sanctions after the Gulf War, and we were the main proponents of the sanctions.
The fallout from U.S. foreign policy sanctions in the Middle East has caused collateral damage for civilians. We have heard that 500,000 children have died. Is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but the price, we think the price is worth it.
Like Madeleine Albright said, you know, it's 500,000 dead Iraqis. We think maybe over a period of 8 or 9 years, this is how many Iraqis have died as a result of sanctions. And what did Madeleine Albright, the great humanitarian, say? Yeah, I think that's just fine. Well, we don't care about the Iraqis, never have. I doubt we ever will. We care about resources. We care about geostrategic placement of our forces.
This is a war about resources, taking the resources of the third world from all over the country, from all over the world. Every war that exists is basically a war over resources.
It was inflicting primarily the most vulnerable people in Iraq. They're elderly people, they're sick people, people with chronic diseases like kidney failure, people who simply couldn't get the most basic of medicines, but then overwhelmingly, children under age 5. And they died by the tens and by the hundreds and by the thousands and by the hundreds of thousands. And they died gruesome and ghastly deaths.
Economic sanctions in general are more of an expression of policy ideas. They're not going to actually accomplish hardly anything.
And yet they allowed the economic sanctions to continue for 13 years. As long as you kept economic sanctions on Iraq, Iraq would not be selling its oil. This meant that Saudi Arabia could almost double the amount of oil that the Saudis were able to sell.
Preventive strikes, which is what the U.S. action in Iraq was, is not legal or not considered ethical under things like the theories of the just war, because in order for a first attack to be considered ethical, there has to be clear evidence that the other side is mobilizing for an imminent strike.
People like to make a distinction between preventative and preemptive. Preemptive is you think they're going to strike, so you get them before they do that. Preventative is they're not planning to attack you, but you think that the war would be good in the long run because you prevent them from doing something that would harm your interest.
This is called a war of aggression, what we did in Iraq. That was totally preemptive. That was the ultimate crime found at Nuremberg in 1946.
Abe Shulsky, the former head of the OSP, building this fairy tale about Iraq to sell this war that they wanted, is working Iran now in the Pentagon in the very same place.
Saddam Hussein's military was in shambles, and he certainly didn't have effective military leaders. Their military leaders were so bad that they even made General Tommy Franks look good by comparison, and there are a few military leaders who are proven more incompetent than General Franks.
The powers that be, so to speak, the president or whoever has decided that they want to go to war somewhere, they will tell you whatever they need to tell you to justify that, whether it be true or false. We saw that with the Niger uranium. Even during Desert Storm, the war I was involved in, there was stories about babies and incubators being thrown out that turned out to be lies. Tanks massing on the border with Saudi Arabia that weren't actually there, which was later proven by satellite photography.
How did the alleged weapons of mass destruction lead us into the Iraq War? Chief of Operations for the CIA Joint Task Force Iraq, Valerie Plame Wilson, had a mission of counter-proliferation to investigate whether Saddam Hussein actually had WMDs.
I knew what we had from months and months of working and trying to find this intelligence. And here was a highly respected Secretary of State, and he's talking about things that in my world I knew not to be entirely accurate. Well, I think it was for me the first time that I stepped back a little bit from the operational weeds and said, what is going on here? Because it was clear we were going to war, and I thought it was a very thin case. They were taking bits and pieces, cherry-picking intelligence to make their case for war.
Her husband, former Ambassador Joseph Wilson, was assigned to a CIA fact-finding mission to investigate if there was actually weapons-grade uranium coming from Niger. When he reported there was not, and publicly accused the president and others of lying to justify the invasion, Valerie, a 20-year CIA veteran, found her name leaked to the press with signs pointing to the vice president's office as the source.
The spin and the way that they create the narrative is masterful. It's lie after lie after lie, but the lies are not discredited until after the fact.
What I saw in the summer of 2002 in the fall, right up to the invasion, was to cherry-pick intelligence, to take things that were not true, that were known not to be true, and to present them as if they were true in order to convince or to allow the president and the vice president to convince the American people that this was a necessary war, which it wasn't. It was not.
There's no way that there's a rational link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. That one was just clearly fabricated, but that's just that they've spun that web of lies so well, and everybody now knows that it was all false premise.
I don't know that Saddam Hussein was directly or indirectly involved with 9/11. I do know that he was an international terrorist. His hands were all over terrorism, and for that reason I believe we were justified in removing him.
Well, I think the links to Al-Qaeda was probably invented. The possibility of that was pretty remote. They were enemies. Saddam Hussein was a secular monster, and Al-Qaeda or Islamist monsters hate each other.
The Office of Special Plans, which existed from September 2002 to June 2003, was a Pentagon unit created by Paul Wolfowitz and headed by Faith. Under U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, they were charged to supply senior Bush administration officials with raw intelligence pertaining to Iraq.
Our office and the Pentagon, we're not supposed to be political, even though we have political appointees in charge. Well, they were not incompetent in propaganda. They were quite incompetent when it came to strategy. What we were seeing throughout the summer, and then once the Office of Special Plans had been formed, were actual written documents, sets of talking points that were very different from the intelligence that we had been seeing.
Cherry-picked intelligence to support the view that Saddam was developing weapons of mass destruction. There are all kind of forms of deceit, like picking the kind of evidence that'll support something that you intend to do.
and then believing it.
There were lies within lies within lies.
We knew years in advance that going into Iraq would exacerbate the problems in the wider Mideast.
In 1994, the Secretary of Defense under President George H.W. Bush was Dick Cheney. He gave an interview explaining why the U.S. should not invade Iraq.
Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? How many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
It's an utter catastrophe. It is pure debacle, the war in Iraq. It was based on complete and utter lies. It was for venal reasons. This was to have been a war for gain, for a small handful of corporate entities.
We know that we should have dealt with it as a matter of criminal law. We never should have called it a war on terrorism. It should, in fact, have been an emergency. We shouldn't have dignified it. We have lunatically overreacted.
In the Iraqi war, I think it is not the question of leading or misleading. I think it was one of the basic mistakes that the administration didn't understand, that it is not Saddam Hussein, it is whom they are fighting. They are invading in different culture that will generate resistance.
There's a real irony that the U.S. comes out and says, oh, we support democracy in the Middle East, but the two democratic countries in the Middle East are Iran and Palestine. They have democratically elected governments, but because they elected somebody that the Bush administration doesn't like, then they don't count.
After they failed to develop weapons of mass destruction, the party line shifted. The goal was really to bring democracy, what the press calls Bush's messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq and the world and Mars and so on.
There are people in the administration, General Jay Garner. He did an interview back in February 2004, Government Executive Magazine, and he said, look, we're planning on being in Iraq for 20 or 30 years.
I regret, however, that a sound post-entry strategy was not formulated, and I don't believe there was one.
We've gone after the wrong people, and when we did go after them, we really didn't have a program. We really didn't know what we wanted to accomplish.
Without the excuse of weapons of mass destruction, is there an underlying agenda for the invasion of Iraq?
I really don't think that we would have done what we have done in Iraq if the oil factor wasn't there.
This kind of discourse is a clearly imperializing discourse that justifies intervention in parts of the world where one would like to establish military bases, where one would like to have control over the oil.
That was the main rationale behind Operation Desert Shield. It was to protect the oil interest in the region.
There were, in fact, major Texas-based oil companies that had broken the economic sanctions, but in a very, very lucrative fashion. Bay Oil had been paying money under the table to Saddam Hussein's government in order to get the most lucrative contracts so that their name would be boosted to the top to get contracts to buy Iraq's oil. And another company, Odin Oil, had actually offloaded enough oil to fill 7 tankers. And these were Jordanian ships that were smuggling the oil and then offloading it onto the Odin oil tankers. This is all according to Senator Levin's committee testimony.
People are now putting their money, their reserve on euro rather than the dollar. And that is the most dangerous thing.
If the Saudi Arabians tomorrow decided that they wanted to be paid for their oil in euros rather than dollars, the dollar would collapse. That's the only thing that holds it up today. The stock exchange would collapse. We would be well on our way toward bankruptcy.
Saddam Hussein, about a year and a half before the invasion, had switched from the dollar to the euro as the currency for oil transactions. And this is a real threat to the American system. And Iran has threatened to do the same thing. That's one reason the U.S. talks about invading Iran.
Asia holds about, last I saw, about 50% of foreign reserves. China and Japan are financing the U.S. economy for a good reason. They want the dollar to remain high, They want the markets, so they're willing to lose money by buying treasury bonds instead of investing in euros.
If the Japanese and the Chinese and all these countries call in their debts, it will mean that America will be a country that will be asking for foreign aid.
You could have a banking crisis on any day.
If the U.S. was to pull out right now, there's a great chance that there will be a proxy war within Iraq between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Sunni and Shia regional powers, that could easily spill over into Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Once you do that, it will be only a matter of time until they start attacking those petroleum production and distribution points as a strategic objective in their little fight amongst one another. Once that happens, 20 to 30% of the global petroleum output will be cut off. An economic, global depression will hit the entire world if we lose 30% of the oil production, even for a week.
If you ask the Iraqis, and we've asked them through a number of polls, variety of polls, when they ask the Iraqis what they want the Americans to do, the answer is to get out. That's what they want us to do. Whether it's quick or slow, they want us gone.
I think you get out of it. I think you leave. What if we leave? You know, will there be a bloodbath between Sunni and Shia? There might be. Will it be any worse than what we're seeing now? We have to ask ourselves that question.
I'm here to rally people to be against the war, work against the war, and to help us in our struggle.
And the people of Iraq need to know that George Bush is not supported. They need to see us out on the streets protesting against this.
Muslims under the Ottoman Empire were a threat to Christian Europe through September 11, 1683. They were defeated on the 12th at the Battle of Vienna by Polish King Jan III Sobieski. September 11, 2001 is thought to be the rise of the new religious fundamentalist Muslim empire against the Christians, perceived as imposing their values through globalization.
Certainly there are people in the Middle East who think that what's going on in Iraq now is just the latest version of the Crusades from the 11th century, the first time the West tried to come in and take over.
I think part of it is that Blair, like Bush, feel that for strong religious, theological reasons, this was the right thing to do.
Our intervention in Iraq has been disastrous. It has led to a confirmation that there's a battle between the East and the West. Our presence in Iraq has led people to believe that there's a battle of Christians versus Muslims, that the United States is out to impose their way of life in the Middle East.
When fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross.
We were there to protect the oil fields, Saudi Arabia from Saddam. Al-Qaeda was upset with Christian soldiers being close to the holy sites. That was their #1 motivation.
Osama bin Laden turned adamantly against the United States. He was part of a faction within the Saudi government, or among the Saudi royal family, that lobbied for not allowing the U.S. troops into Saudi Arabia. It's the Holy Land. We can't let non-believers into the Holy Land, was his rationale.
What we're supposed to believe in the United States is that the U.S. would have, as they call it, liberated Iraq, even if its main export was, say, pickles and asparagus, and the world's energy resources were in southern Africa.
If the United States was really interested in democracy, there are plenty of countries with which we closely cooperate that are clearly undemocratic, and yet we're not pushing for regime change there. The policy of regime change may be perceived worldwide as being selective.
What we've done there, what the West, but particularly what America has done there, is creating enmity of an unfathomable proportion.
The United States is the dominant power in not only in military terms, but in economic and cultural terms. So our culture is changing many parts of the world.
It's nothing to do with our films or our books or our television or our clothing. It's nothing to do with sex or religion. It has to do with the U.S. government going around the Middle East and elsewhere and bombing people, overthrowing governments, supporting dictatorships, suppressing popular social movements, torturing people, All these terrible things we've been doing for decades and decades.
Abuses by the U.S. government have taken a page from history with the imprisonment of political prisoners, torture and abuse, much like what was seen at the Soviet Gulag.
No prison that I encountered used torture. Now we have a prison for political differences with the President of the United States, and there is an application of torture at the prison.
There are some things that I think are clearly off limits. They should be off limits for a democratic society, and that would include torture.
There's nothing in the Constitution that says he gets to commit felonies, and yet immediately after 9/11, he was ordering the Central Intelligence Agency to engage in this odd euphemism that they use, extraordinary rendition. Extraordinary rendition means the kidnapping of people from any place on earth, secretly flying them to countries like Syria or Egypt, where they certainly will be tortured. We've had numerous CIA officials, high-ranking officials in the Middle East say, if you want a good interrogation, you might send them to Jordan. If you want them to just disappear, you send them to Egypt.
It happened to me too, in the Soviet Union, in the area known as the archipelago Gulag, used by Stalin.
Of course, it is easy to interrogate people when you can torture them. We know this from the Stalin's time, from the Hitler time. It depends how you will torture them. But from the other side, it's fully useless, because if you are interrogating them in this way, and they have this strong psychological and physical pressure, they will confess everything what you want them to say. We know in the Soviet Union, after Stalin time, after a week of the interrogation, they confess everything, that they were Japanese spies, they were British spies, they plotted against this. So if you use it as a tool to control the society, I wouldn't say it was effective, but it have logic. But if you really want to figure out something, to find truth, it's the worst way to make this, and you compromising your own system.
Stalin's tactics are still used today. Amnesty International uses the term rendition to describe the CIA practice of covert imprisonment of persons of interest moved to third-party countries, such as Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, to prisons referred to as black sites for detention and interrogation. This circumvents U.S. law and has brought allegations of torture. The case of Maher Arar is just one example.
Extraordinary rendition presents some critical problems. First, it violates the international law prohibiting torture. The United Nations Convention Against Torture and the Degrading Treatment or Punishment, a treaty ratified by our country in 1994, explicitly prohibits the transfer of persons to countries where there's a substantial likelihood that they will be tortured.
I was detained and interrogated by the United States government, transported to Syria against my will, tortured, and kept there for a year. I'm here today because I believe it is my moral duty as a human being to help prevent what happened to me from happening to others. I also hope to convey how fragile our human rights have become and how easily they can be taken from us by the same governments that have sworn to protect them.
What is the relationship between national security and the image of the nation abroad? For example, if our nation has suffered a loss of standing in the world, does that impact our national security?
What kind of lesson are we sending to third world countries if we as governments in the West, we don't abide by our own laws? And on the other hand, we are asking them to become democratic. I think it damages the credibility of the United States.
The largest known CIA covert prison is in Afghanistan, codenamed the Salt Pit. Locations and names of other black sites facilities are classified. Abu Ghraib prison was known as a prison of torture under Saddam Hussein, but later came to world attention with abuse of prisoners by U.S. soldiers.
Then later, there was public knowledge of the photos that came out of Abu Ghraib. The Army has covered all of this up as long as there was nothing that made it to the public, no visual evidence. If there's visual evidence, find the lowest ranking men that you can, court-martial them, say that you've cleaned all this up.
There has been a great deal of controversy regarding prisoners' rights, legal counsel, and violations of civil rights under U.S. policy. Torture is also a violation of international law.
Torturing a prisoner is something entirely new to the United States, and particularly to his military. Came out of Rumsfeld's office by the person of Lieutenant General William Jerry Boykin. And I've served with Boykin and known the man for almost 30 years. Boykin's position, and I think he's still there, is Deputy Undersecretary of Intelligence. From there, the legal cover for that came from the current Attorney General when he was White House counsel, which is the Geneva Codes are quaint. They're obsolete. We can do. Basically, we're the most powerful. We can do as we please.
The theory of a unitary executive branch, which essentially attempts to use the Commander-in-Chief clause of the Constitution to place the President beyond international law, beyond the Constitution, if he invokes what he's doing to say that he's doing it in a matter of national security. Thus, we have the scandals of torture at prisons in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. Nothing in the Constitution permits the President to commit felonies with impunity. Yet a few days after 9/11, he issued secret orders to the Central Intelligence Agency to abduct terrorist suspects anywhere on earth.
Whatever policies we adopt in the war on terrorism, those policies should be consistent with international law. And the abduction of people, the extraordinary renditions without access to legal counsel, all of those kinds of things are very troubling from the standpoint of international as well as United States law.
Terrorism is defined as the use of terror to achieve political goals. Yes, United States could be one of the states that one could consider as terrorist states.
We've been running, and still are, the military base at Fort Benning, Georgia, a school to teach Latin American military officers state terrorism. We've been doing it for years. Any number of famous Latin American torturers of civilians are graduates of what was called the School of the Americas.
Take Central America. There's no question that we funded people in El Salvador and Nicaragua that I would say are indeed terrorists. Our record in some parts of the world does not bear very close scrutiny.
If you want to counter terror, build justice.
Political flunkies and lackeys like Boykin, hoping to get that next star and having personal agendas there, execute those ideas. They turn them into fact. And in this case, the grand apostle of this activity in the military was a man named Major General Jeffrey Miller. Miller's the one that implemented it in Guantanamo. They were so happy with what they were doing. It went to Afghanistan. Within weeks of his arrival and bringing that technique to Afghanistan, we're seeing deaths during interrogation, men tortured to death, smothered to death, waterboarding, some of the other stuff, dying stuff face first down into sleeping bags with somebody sitting on their chest. And then it went to Iraq.
It one mistake in this long chain of mistakes, because it is one attempt to use not democratic behavior in the democratic world.
Our actions really do make a difference. And for many peoples throughout the world, our actions in Iraq, the prisoner scandal in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and so on have really hurt. For many people, what they view Iraq as is one that we have betrayed some of our own principles.
I went to Guantanamo, toured the place, spent the day there, and I am convinced that the people who are at Guantanamo are there for a good reason. Now, admittedly, I saw what they wanted me to see.
To talk about the Guantanamo Bay, the outside world, they're not looking in the United States at the societies that protecting human rights. They're saying, no, you are violating human rights. And how you can say that we are violating is you're doing the same.
Guantanamo does violate the Geneva Conventions. It's violating those which require certain treatment, not just of prisoners of war, but of civilians and people out of combat. So those people in Guantanamo are people out of combat. And we've called them unlawful combatants in order to bypass this prisoner of war issue. And then we had the leaked memo saying we don't have to abide by the Geneva Conventions in this case.
They're not American citizens. They're keeping them not on the American territory just to keep them outside the American jurisdiction.
We've got to do a lot better job of identifying who people are at Guantanamo, their relationship to the war on terror, and providing them with the legal framework that allows them due process. It all has to be done within a legal framework that reflects both international and American law.
Let the Geneva Conference be the controlling feature there.
The United States offered high bounties for the capture of suspected enemies. Most people detained or sent to Guantanamo Bay detention camp were not captured on any battlefield, but instead were turned over to U.S. custody for the bounty after being taken from their homes or their streets with no proof of any hostile acts.
I guarantee you, it's a high crime and a misdemeanor to order a felony to go out and start kidnapping people around the world. We see the scandals of Guantanamo every day, in which 90% of the people there were not arrested by Americans. They were arrested by the Northern Alliance, in the Afghan Civil War that we reignited after 9/11, and that these people were being paid bounties by the Americans for every time they brought one in.
If the truth about renditions and prisoners is hidden from public scrutiny, are there other deceptions by government leaders?
It's very difficult not to be gullible because we want to believe that our government is knowledgeable. We want to believe that our government is not going to lie to us.
Since the Korean conflict, the United States has become involved in large and small-scale wars, insurgency campaigns, election manipulation, regime changes, assassinations, and covert operations continually in all regions of the globe to the present day. Covert operations, even when successful, may result with a negative blowback against U.S. foreign policy. Secret operations might be necessary for security of a nation, but there is little public accountability or public oversight.
Any secret organization is corrupt. It doesn't necessarily start out that way, but it becomes corrupt because it can hide personal failings, it can hide wrongdoing, it can hide venality, greed, lust for power, and who the hell's riding herd over it?
It's simply beyond oversight. No citizen can hope to do effective oversight on the Department of Defense or the 16 intelligence agencies, since so much of what they do is secret. 40% of the defense budget is black. That is, it allegedly concerns highly classified projects. I say allegedly because we don't know, and usually they turn out to be boondoggles of the sort that sends congressmen to prison, usually for bribery or things of this sort.
Secret military organizations, I feel, are a threat to our republic. Delta forces and some others, they answer to no one. They don't answer to Congress.
Covert operations conducted by governments, corporations, or other organizations, which are designed to appear as if they're being carried out by other entities as pretext for war, are called false flags.
A false flag operation is pretty self-descriptive, but it means an attack that is under, it's a form of deception. It's blamed on the Arab extremists, but somebody else actually committed the operation.
It has long been suspected that the Nazis started the Reichstag fire to justify Hitler's crackdown on civil liberties, a false flag. Some say 9/11 is the modern version to take away American civil liberties.
Among the many risks, in terms of false flag events, they could stage an attack that they blame on the Iranians in the Gulf. There could be no attack at all. It could be like the Gulf of Tonkin, just a complete fiction. And then start a war with Iran, and or do a domestic event and blame the Iranians on for that.
It was a total lie that the U.S. ships had been attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, and that was used by Johnson as a pretext to expand the war.
We hear what we're told and by this administration, and what that is everything that will demonize the Iranians. Take little bits of truth and demonize your enemy, such that at the slightest provocation or at the slightest incident, we will be, as a country, Americans will be able to say, yeah, let's bomb them.
When a superpower uses force to gain economic and political control of production and finance capital in less developed regions, it is termed imperialism.
Traditionally, imperialism is thought of in economic terms, and we continue to exercise a great deal of economic imperialism.
One has to recognize that it is the dominant group that sets the rules. And to the extent that the Bretton Woods Accord, the Bretton Woods system, was created when most of these countries were not even countries, nation states. They were still colonies. And this dominant group, the United States, Britain, etc., sets the rules in terms of International Monetary Fund or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which we call World Bank. And those rules were set without consultation or without even caring what the colonies felt. With the emergence of the colonies into nation states in the 60s, it became difficult for International Monetary Fund to still use the rules that were applicable in the 40s to them.
The World Bank and the IMF were part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. You can say they're sister agencies to the United Nations.
The World Bank is an international organization, therefore not subject to any form of congressional scrutiny.
The United States is the major shareholder of the World Bank. And as a practice, the United States always appoints the president of the World Bank. The Europeans appoint the managing director of the IMF.
When they give a loan, it comes with the demand that the recipient government cut back very sharply on its social welfare programs and all kinds of price supports and health help and so on. And this causes, obviously, great hardship to the people of the recipient nation.
Powerful forces like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank are main proponents of globalization policies. Critics point out that this formula of globalization is being enforced and propelled by transnational corporations, largely unaccountable for their actions, aided by these institutions and governments.
The third world country is heavily indebted. It owes money to its international creditors. It owes money to the World Bank, to the IMF, to what is called the Paris Club. And it can't pay off its debts.
The main clients of the IMF and the World Bank are the multinational corporations. It's for their benefit that these things are done. These countries have to cut back sharply on their expenditures to be more appealing to foreign investment.
World Bank and IMF policies of conditionality really caused a lot of harm, and they demanded instant release of price controls.
They deregulated the exchange rate, and then prices just went fly high, and then they said, oh no, we can't increase wages because that causes inflation. And in the meantime, people's earnings had collapsed by 90%.
Always one of those is raising interest rates, often to ridiculously high levels, 20% and plus, which has the effect of stifling domestic investment, because who can borrow money to invest and create economic development at that rate within the country? Very few, while assuring a high return on foreign investment.
If Suharto in Indonesia, maybe the most corrupt dictator in the modern period, has billions of dollars of debt, You don't take the billions of dollars that, from him and his family who robbed it. What you do is impose structural adjustment programs, conditionalities, on poor Indonesians, which destroy their lives so that the debts can be paid off to the rich investors.
The money that goes into the privatization fund actually is intended to pay back the people who are the creditors and who are very often involved in acquiring the assets which are being put on the auction block.
Clearly, those policies that require overnight privatization, for example, they create hardship in the countries where they are practiced, and it gives the impression of taking advantage of a desperate person.
These economic policies are repeated worldwide. Many immigrants to the U.S. are indeed desperate. Often they are seen as scapegoats for the effects of economic globalization on a faltering U.S. economy. They take jobs unfilled by Americans that would otherwise be outsourced. The real problem presented by illegal immigration is security, not the supposed threat to the economy.
The militarization of the border was initiated by Clinton in 1994, Operation Gatekeeper. Something else happened in 1994. NAFTA was implemented. And they could perceive that the effect of NAFTA is going to be to undermine Mexican agriculture, which cannot compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, undermine small Mexican businesses, which aren't going to be able to compete with U.S. corporations that get national treatment in Mexico. So sooner or later, there'll be a flood of people north. We better militarize the border.
There's no doubt that security on the Mexican-American border is a joke.
The wall is not really going to make the difference of anything. Even to save your country, even to stop our people, this is not the way to work. There are other ways to keep your country safe. And again, this to think that we are human, that we are people. Yes, and we have families, we have life, we have dreams. We just want to be and work together.
When you're talking about the United States' relationship with Mexico and Latin America and the Caribbean, from a trade perspective, you're talking about two main pacts. We're talking about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and SAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which includes all of the countries that are involved in the Caribbean Basin Initiative and several other Central American governments.
NAFTA is not equal. Even if you are working in a good factory, then the payment is a little higher than some of the Mexicans, but it's not the real pay that we need. That's why we need to work more about that, to be more equal, to have the same opportunities there and here.
SAFTA is not so good because United States corporations and the United States commercialization will take advantage of low-wage workers in these areas.
The U.S. executive director of the IMF once described the IMF as the credit community's enforcer. Okay. Now, the IMF is, which is basically a branch of close to a branch of the Treasury Department, is dedicated, like a good deal of policy, to undermine the threat of capitalism and of democracy.
It used to be that countries were considered superpowers. Now what we see is that it's corporations, transnational corporations.
If we look who is behind, let's say, U.S. public policy, it's Wall Street.
I have a theory. I always said there are no more superpowers but supermarket in the world. The one that controls the market controls.
Regime changes, transnational corporations, and 9/11, how are these connected?
The IMF and the World Bank started to perform a new role, which was that of exerting control over these highly indebted countries and essentially establishing an alternative parallel government to the national government of these countries.
Behind the ostensible government sits enthroned an invisible government owing no allegiance and acknowledging no responsibility to the people.
The problem is globalization has gone so fast that we lack the structures to provide adequate regulation around it.
The elite of the elite would be running the world, in effect. Investment bankers are my invisible government. They're real powers behind the throne. That combines those two things. You know, what makes the world go around? It ain't love, it's money and power.
When a government is dependent on bankers for money, they, and not the leaders of the government, control the situation. Money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain.
I think the end is the execution of American financial power wherever it decides to take it and exercise that power in the world.
It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause.
When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order.
We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order.
There was something called the Project for a New American Century that actually was a position paper by some neoconservatives in government outlining what they would like to see as kind of the future role of the United States, which was basically to dominate the rest of the world economically, militarily, culturally. But they needed to have some change take place before that was possible, and that change might only be possible if it were precipitated by some catastrophe such as Pearl Harbor. Considering these people were major players in government at the time, one can certainly see where 9/11 would work to their advantage.
Are you happy with the official story about 9/11?
The vast majority of Americans, unfortunately, buy the mainstream media version, which always turns out later to have been a crock of lies, usually fed by government officials.
I'm standing outside D.H. Griffin Wrecking Company, based in Greensboro, North Carolina, which was chosen by the DDC as the consultant in charge of all demolition operations at the World Trade Center site following the 9/11 disaster. The company response team oversaw and approved all demolition activities associated with the cleanup project. Weeks Marine Incorporated, the Cranford, New Jersey corporation, was the firm responsible for offloading by barge from Manhattan more than 1.2 million tons of structural steel and other debris. No one from FEMA would talk with me, so I tried for over a year to interview David Griffin Jr. to find out if he could shed light on rumors of detonation caps being found in the debris, or if he knew why the steel was removed before a thorough forensic analysis took place. All attempts to schedule an interview were rejected with no explanation.
It's all fakery. Arab hijackers didn't do all this. It was an inside job. It was our own elements of our own government.
According to recent polls, about a third of the population believes that the Bush administration was responsible for 9/11. Either they directly arranged it or they made sure it would happen. But what's particularly striking is that, and tells you something about American democracy, is that this huge number of people thinks that the government is run by mass murderers who are purposely murdering Americans and doesn't think they can do anything about it.
That goes along with the PNAC, Project for a New American Century. It would take some sort of major disaster to cause the fear among people, who would then in turn give the government liberties that they wouldn't otherwise give them, give up their own liberties that they wouldn't otherwise give up, and allow the government to take actions that they wouldn't otherwise agree with the government taking in order to put that plan in motion.
The 9/11 attack on U.S. soil created fear, frustration, resentment, and retaliatory strikes against Afghanistan, and with subsequent preemptive strikes against Iraq.
Osama bin Laden's been dead since 18th of December 2001. He was at the Battle of Tora Bora. There was an American team that made its way there. There were 2 Afghan militias holding the Arabs, the foreign fighters, in that big, long defensive position at Torgar Mountain. Took several days, realizing that bin Laden was there, and eventually got an airstrike in late in the afternoon when he would come out of his cave to communicate by radio to his fighters. And he was bombed. If he survived the initial one, he didn't survive the night. The pounding on that mountain sealed off the caves that the survivors had gone back into. They collapsed. And he has never been credibly seen or heard from since. One of the members of the team who brought that about came to see me. And then he told me his story. And a book is coming out about that.
There is no doubt that we've gotten a military industrial university congressional complex of interlocking interests that are then, even maybe it includes also the world of journalism, which is actually turned into the Ministry of Propaganda, who provides the rationale for how we are still an exceptional country.
The media is slower than Congress in finding its backbone. We may be in the age that the independent media has gone the way of the buffalo. If we do, it's a great danger to our republic.
There's a deeply ingrained imperial mentality which almost has a compelling effect on accepting the nobility of the state, whatever it's doing. Actually, there's even a name for it. It's called American exceptionalism.
We're all brainwashed, psyoped into, we're so good. It's American exceptionalism, it's termed, right? We're the only nation that's great in world history. We can do no wrong. We're always the good guys, and our government is too. Isn't that, it's been called the Disneyfication of history.
One of the main obstacles to making an impression upon the American mind about U.S. foreign policy, the main obstacle to changing their views about U.S. foreign policy is that they hold a very basic and deep-seated belief that no matter what the U.S. government does abroad, no matter how bad it may look, the government means well, that their intentions are honorable. They may lie on occasion, they may blunder, they may on occasion do more harm than good, but this basic belief teaches Americans that the intentions are noble. If you hold that basic belief, it's very difficult to accept the idea that the U.S. government in Iraq, for example, is doing something which they shouldn't do, because the intentions are good. If you accept the intentions, you tend to support the policy. Even if the policy seems to be failing, the policy itself is not questioned. And it's very difficult to change people's minds about that. They have been raised to believe this, that starting certainly with the Second World War, which we call the Good War, since then, all our interventions have been for good purposes. We have been fighting an evil called communism, and now an evil called terrorism. We have overthrown dictatorships. This is all part of the mythology.
What my rule is if the corporate media and the government tell you something and it's controversial, the government and the corporate media are lying. It's Reynolds' rule. If it's controversial, the mainstream is wrong.
Before the invasion of Iraq, there was that big demonstration, and there were 2 million demonstrators that when we went home to our televisions, it was like there were a few thousand people in the streets. No, there were not. But those 2 million demonstrators in D.C. were shown in the Arab world. They were shown on Al Jazeera.
The dedication to ensure that there be no alternative voice is near fanaticism. The U.S. is dedicated to destroying Al Jazeera.
I always encourage my students to go on the internet, go to the BBC, go to Arab news agencies, and see a different perspective, because more likely than not, the truth is somewhere in between.
The government, as much as it would like to, cannot control information. And the fact is, technologically, it cannot control information. China is a totalitarian state, regardless of what they might want to say. And it tries extremely hard to manage the internet, to manage information flow in that vast country, and they can't do it. So if China can't do it, our country can't do it.
The anti-war movement in the 60s was an object of attack, a target of attack by the FBI and other intelligence agencies. Whenever there's a challenge to this government's policy, especially foreign policy, there will be an attack.
In the 60s, many people protested against U.S. foreign policy about Vietnam and burned draft cards or fled the country to avoid the draft. In June 1967, former world heavyweight champion Cassius Clay, also known as Muhammad Ali, was convicted of violating the Selective Service Act after refusing to take the oath of induction into the Army to fight the Vietnam War, claiming that he was an ordained black Muslim minister and should be exempt.
We don't want to institute a draft. And so it's a
dilemma for the United States.
There will not be a draft in this country. The American people are too disengaged from empire. They don't want a draft. They don't want to pay attention. And the government doesn't want the American people to pay attention, and a draft would create that.
Fascism is an authoritarian political ideology that considers individual and other societal interests subordinate to the needs of the state. Without safeguards and the new powers given to the federal government, American civil liberties could vanish.
This is the nature of fascism. It's not one party, two party, or a vibrant political system. This is institution against anybody who challenges the institution, which could be you people, any filmmaker, any documentary, anybody.
The United States has promoted a system of dominance, a system of inequality, and a system of violence, because any time a country has stood up to the United States, they've risked their lives and the lives of their children and their future.
Amnesty International said that the Military Commissions Act contravenes human rights principles, and an editorial in the New York Times described the act as a tyrannical law that will be ranked with the low points in American democracy, our generation's version of the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is a dangerous bill.
The United States today finds itself in an extremely fragile, unstable configuration in which it must make some very difficult, very costly choices, or else it will, like the Roman Republic, we will lose our domestic democracy and become a military dictatorship.
A government that is voiced by the people has participation and contestation, where people get out in the streets and then they contest whatever they feel like they can contest because they have no fear of reprisals.
We could be recapitulating the history of the Roman Republic, that we will continue down this path, stagger down it under the facade of constitutional government until we are one huge military-industrial complex. And at that point, we'll simply turn it over to the Pentagon. General Tommy Franks, the commander in the assault on Baghdad, has already said in print that in case of another 9/11, he sees no choice but for us to take over.
Since 9/11, of course, we all have seen this restriction of civil liberties, the increase of the police state. Now, where this leads is hard to say.
There is nothing more unstable than a country that combines a domestic democracy with a foreign empire. That it can be one or the other, an imperialist nation or a democratic nation. But if it tries to be both, it's going to lose its democracy, that the military ultimately will take over.
Ever since the attack on 9/11, we've been wrestling with the constitutional dilemmas of national security, presidential war powers, and the place of constitutional civil liberties. The way in which we discuss, define, and resolve these issues are the ways in which we express our disagreements or come to agreements are of great importance to people around the world, especially to those in aspiring democracies. What is the price of freedom, and are we giving away our rights without question?
9/11, the attack, unprovoked, unsolicited attack, by the way, upon us on 9/11 has changed the way we live in this country. The Patriot Act is an example of that. There has been much criticism and much favor attributed to the Patriot Act, and I am among the latter group. I favor the Patriot Act. I think the Patriot Act has served us well. Now, sometimes we may have to give up a liberty or two.
It reminds you again of Benjamin Franklin's favorite statement. He said, if you give up your civil liberties for greater security, you don't deserve either your liberty or your security.
I think that, there are a lot of things that Americans are quite prepared to live with for the sake of security, including inconveniences at airports and things like that. I think when you begin talking about tapping telephone calls, about getting bank records and things like that without some kind of court order, I think most Americans are very, very uncomfortable about that.
The Judiciary Committee issued subpoenas for documents related to President Bush's program involving eavesdropping without warrants after Bush claimed authority to order this in his role as Commander-in-Chief following the September 11th attack. The Vice President's office refused to cooperate.
I've never known an administration so willing to operate outside the law, even to operate against the law, in violation of the law, as this administration. Certainly not since I've been old enough to vote, have we had an administration so willing to ignore the law? Well, I want the American public to know exactly what they did.
The Patriot Act, the most abominable, unconstitutional, hateful, from the point of freedom, piece of legislation since the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798.
Policies that have been implemented here in the United States in the name of anti-terrorism do have serious repercussions for civil liberties, and I am among those who are certainly concerned about restrictions on civil liberties, whether they come in the form of legislation like the Patriot Act or data mining and things of that nature.
We live in America that spies on its citizens without warrants. We live in an America that can read our emails and check our bank accounts without a warrant. We live under a regime that took away our rights to habeas corpus and due process. And thus, anybody that George Bush says is a terrorist, they can do this to. I'm just waiting for my turn.
Any form of control, anything that heightens governmental control of the population, to me is potentially destructive. And something of that nature, an ID, smart chip, I don't think the benefits are going to be worth the potential consequences.
Question is, have you been engaged in espionage?
My answer to that question, Senator, is a citation from the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be compelled to be a witness against himself.
The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government.
You have this craziness on each society. In the Soviet Union, Stalin created the same hysteria fighting against terrorism and the enemies of the people, the McCarthyism trying to do the same. It's very similar now with this anti-terrorist hysteria.
And again, the fascinating thing about the Patriot Act is that how long it had been in the works. 9/11 had simply all of a sudden offered these rather unscrupulous people unbelievable opportunities, and they went back and simply hit the print button on their computer. It was there and ready to go.
They did take full advantage of it. The Patriot Act must have been written in advance because it was submitted to Congress only days after 9/11. There's no way such a large piece of legislation could be prepared in that amount of time.
John Ashcroft told the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee the Patriot Act was so important that they didn't have time to read the statute before they could vote on it. Imagine that. 2 members of the Senate claimed they read it, and one of them is now dead, Paul Wellstone. He voted against it. Russ Feingold says he read it. He voted against it. Ron Paul and his colleagues in the House were given 15 minutes on the House intranet, the internal internet for members of Congress and their staffs to read the Patriot Act. It's 315 pages long, and it doesn't read like a novel. I have read it. I have read it twice. In order to read it, you have to have in front of you the entire United States Criminal Code, because most of the Patriot Act says in 14 U.S.C. 1523, move the comma, change or to and, change 6 months to 8 months. It will take days to read this. Members of the House, without having had the opportunity to read it at all in any way, never mind meaningful in any way, nevertheless, with no debate on the floor, fearing what John Ashcroft told them, voted for the Patriot Act, and it passed, and the Senate voted for it, and with 2 dissents, it passed, and the President signed it.
We in the Judiciary Committee conducted, I believe, 11 or 12 public hearings. Our subcommittee, the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, we were involved with 9 public hearings. And when some of the opponents of the Patriot Act contend that this was not thoroughly examined. That's hogwash. It was very thoroughly examined as a result of 11 hearings.
The Patriot Act was being debated openly and publicly until the anthrax scare. And in the anthrax scare, all bets were off. New provisions were added into what was the version of the Patriot Act that came out of the House Judiciary Committee. And it was so hastily put together and the votes so hastily scheduled that not enough copies had been printed by the White House printing office for every member of Congress to have received it.
Now you may say, well, what about the First Amendment? The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. But the Patriot Act says if you tell anyone, your spouse, your lawyer, your priest, your best friend, a judge in a federal courtroom, that's right, every challenge of the Patriot Act has been an anonymous challenge, because if you reveal to a judge in a courtroom that you received one of these self-written search warrants, you'll be arrested when you walk outside the courtroom. Congress just forgot about the First Amendment.
Then all of these various delicts have been compounded by the Patriot Act that added new exemptions, new clauses, new gimmicks that simply make our police and intelligence services less accountable.
What about the Fourth Amendment? What about the requirement of a judge before the government can get information from a financial institution? Congress said, forget about it. The times are too tough. It's too difficult. We don't want another 9/11.
The president chose to do secretively, to order the National Security Agency to begin to carry out a massive collection of information against American citizens, clear violations of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA Act that you were referring to, of 1978, which was also intended to get around Article 4 of the Constitution, illegal intrusions into our lives, and to at least provide some kind of court sanction.
Various forms of spying that the current administration has pretty much admitted to engaging in, and the way that they always admit it, is quite interesting too, because it's always for our safety.
Here's the bargain. Give me your freedom and I'll keep you safe. It has never worked. It makes us less free and unsafe.
Well, it's all based on fear. It's all based on fear. And post 9/11 is a prime example of that. The Patriot Act, you create an atmosphere of fear, and then you undermine civil rights legislatively, and ultimately the underpinnings of our democracy are threatened by that much more than they are by the terrorists.
By fear-mongering, it helps them kind of consolidate power and encourage people to give up more liberties so that they can do what they want to.
Today, the president tries to say, because of the Commander-in-Chief clause in the Constitution, if I say it's a matter of national security, anything I do is legal, and nobody can touch me on it. That's something new, and what we keep wondering, when will the Supreme Court wake up and begin to pay attention to what we in this country are about to lose, our civil rights.
Congress has lost its backbone as the defender of the institution. The history of the 20th century expansion of presidential power is to get broader and broader and to begin to make more and more of these claims of inherent executive powers, to imagine emergencies even when they're not really emergencies, and to justify the exercise of power in that way.
There are dictators all over the world that the United States and Britain and any of the other Western countries haven't done anything to stop them for their genocide and for their actions in their own countries. But because Iraq has oil, I think that's the one thing that makes the biggest difference on why we're there now.
Why aren't we in Darfur? Joey Cheek is an Olympic gold medal winning speed skater. In 2006, he donated his winnings to the Right to Play organization, serving Darfuri refugees in Chad. What has the government done?
Darfur, for example, there we've been dragging our feet tremendously.
This is something that people find rather difficult to understand, the Europeans especially, because we had always sort of taken a leadership position in helping people who were in dire straits.
I have today signed an executive order providing for the establishment of a Peace Corps.
The richest, most powerful nation on the planet has declared that a genocide has occurred. And this is all in the wake of Rwanda, and has stepped back and watched it continue. What would you think of us?
Well, they'd be afraid. They might even be terrified. They might even regard us as the rogue superpower, or as a nation that the planet simply can't tolerate to continue with those kinds of views.
Genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a national, political, racial, ethnic, or cultural group. Modern democratic governments are not known to have committed domestic genocide. Documented cases of this are seen in countries whose governments are authoritarian, dictatorial, or totalitarian.
Since the end of the Cold War, we were going to have a new world order and intervene in different places to protect human rights. And that was all brought, came crashing down with the Rwandan genocide in 1994, when nobody stepped in as 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. And yet it seems to be playing out again in Darfur, since that crisis has now been going on for about as long as the war in Iraq. So, whatever we do now is going to be too little too late.
I think Darfur region, it is a shame that the United States just talks about genocide and wouldn't act.
We know when we do evil things. It was Ronald Reagan who invented the phrase for the Soviet Union, evil empire. But I also have no doubt that today we are the evil empire.
The price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men.
The government's unconstrained. They can do what they think they can get away with, and they've gotten away with a tremendous amount so far. So we can only work to try and get the beast under control, bring this rogue superpower under control. Without another war,
there can be the potential for a rogue element if it's coupled with radical right-wing ideology, and it always is, it seems to be, because that's the sort of personality that gravitates to that world.
The World Court found that what we did was illegal, which is true, and as a result of that, in the minds of people, we look at the United States as a rogue country.
The president has engaged in activities that are clearly not authorized in the Constitution for him to do. That after all, he got a vote to invade Iraq by sending to the Congress a national intelligence estimate that he and the authors of the CIA all knew was dishonest when they sent it to them.
None of it had anything to do with weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, 9/11, or Iraqi democracy, or anything good for the Iraqi people.
Now, one of the big problems here would be that they could fast forward this thing into a full-bore fascist police state as the worst outcome if they staged another 9/11, which I don't doubt they would do when they see the need.
The constitutional system, that's what's come apart. It's clearly a shambles. If today you believe the government in Washington bears some resemblance to that document written in Philadelphia in 1787, the burden of proof is on you.
Realize the Constitution has, is defunct, basically. That our country is behaving in the most radical of imperialistic ways in our name, creating enemies by the second, accumulating debt by the second that someone has to pay for.
The Bill of Rights is wonderful, but it's meaningless if the separation of powers breaks down. Checks and balances, that's what keeps us going. When you combine this with an almost out-of-control defense budget that is actually threatening bankruptcy in the country, the intrusions of the military-industrial complex into the civilian economy, to the point that today that A great deal of what we're spending in this $1 trillion a year, trillion, it's 1,000 billion, more than any other defense budget on earth, that than the rest of the world's combined defense budgets. It's simply astronomical.
I believe in just the decency and the wisdom of the American people. They want to believe their leaders, but eventually you lie to them long enough and they realize the difference between what you say and what you're doing, and they start to turn. They always do, and they're doing that now.
I grew up in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, and since that time, Korea, Vietnam, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, Grenada, the first Gulf War, Kosovo, Afghanistan, now this war in Iraq. And they talk to us about the great war on terror. The greatest terror that we face is the terror of what will happen if we continue to pour our wealth, our productivity, our resources into constant war. We're being driven and pulled in a very wrong-headed direction by some very reckless and dangerous people.
One of the paragraphs in my manifesto is this: it's the first duty of the strong to protect the weak. It's not the duty of the strong to prey on the weak.
It is not enough to be strong. We have to also have the moral authority to lead.
We have a way of dealing with unsatisfactory political leaders. It's called impeachment. I guarantee you, it's a high crime and a misdemeanor to lie to the American Congress and people on going to war with a fake, set-up national intelligence estimate.
If a real prosecutor came in, which I would advocate, we have enough to arrest and no doubt indict by a grand jury a number of people I would arrest, from Bush Cheney on down.
I spent a number of my years as a college undergraduate as an activist with SDS, Students for Democratic Society. I was chairman of the Columbia chapter of SDS, and I was the last national secretary of SDS. I was a founder of the Weather Underground, and I was 7.5 years as a fugitive. The problem with SDS in its latter incarnation, when I was a national leader, is that we moved towards violence. We had a theory of revolutionary guerrilla warfare, and we had a belief that this was a revolutionary time. Neither was true. It was not a revolutionary time, and even if it had been, revolutionary guerrilla warfare would not promote revolution in this country. So we were just outright wrong in our theory. In 1973, the United States CIA led a coup against a democratically elected government in Chile. The Weather Underground bombed the corporate headquarters of the ITT, the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, which had a number of investments in Chile and was purported to be cooperative with the coup. It's my belief that property destruction plays into the government's hands. It allows the government to brand the movement as violent and terroristic.
In March 2007, ITT Corporation became the first major defense contractor to be convicted for criminal violation of the Arms Export Control Act.
I mean, look, take myself. You know, I haven't just been involved in dissent, I've been involved in resistance. I was in and out of jail, I was facing a long jail sentence.
Many of us, I would like to say, were people who had already gone to prison. I'd done 9 months for planting corn on a nuclear missile silo site. I've been arrested 61 times.
Think about what you're doing and make sure that, you know, you feel comfortable with your conscience.
I felt like I had been betrayed, not just personally from a 20-year career, but that, you know, that I should speak out while I still could.
My worldview changed in the military. The hardest thing for any man to lose is his illusions.
The Vietnam War was fought by the United States between 1965 and 1973. It was the longest war the country had experienced. It divided the nation and generated the largest and most successful anti-war movement in the United States history, often referred to as the war at home, fought on the streets and campuses throughout the nation. Today we see protests about the war in Iraq with millions of Americans who have taken to the streets, who hold protests at college campuses, who discuss the moralities of the war, and who demand the United States to withdraw their troops.
The anti-war movement as a whole was successful. We helped end the war in Vietnam. We established the political context in this country under which there was no alternative but for the government to withdraw. Also, the anti-war movement was within the military. It got to the point where the military was so rebellious and mutinous that they couldn't be used. They had to be withdrawn.
Think about the great movements in American history. The civil rights movement that started in places like Greensboro, North Carolina. Who knew that silence was a betrayal. Who walked into a lunch encounter and sat down and stood up for every single man to speak out later against the war in Vietnam. We need that kind of strength and courage from you again. You can make such a difference.
Each individual has to figure out how they best can contribute either to research, education, or activism.
I began to speak out against what I saw to be a misuse of information and power and intelligence to foment a war that had been long desired, apparently.
I had turned in my commanders for violating the Geneva Conventions.
Don't get a government job. Try to keep your independence, and that's financial independence, it's intellectual independence, which comes through education, a willingness to accept that your government may lie to you, because historically our government has lied to us.
I just think the Patriot Act was a huge mistake that it will take us a long time to fix.
It is the duty of the patriot to protect his country from its government.
We're all citizens, you know. If there's something that we don't like and we think is wrong, do something about it. Write a letter, make a telephone call, send an email, ask the question, write the president.
Encourage people to talk to their congresspeople, encourage demonstrations, encourage people to talk to the media.
Educate people in a way that Gandhi did, confront them with the truth and ask them to act on that.
The greatest impact of the civil rights movement on me was the notion that what an individual does can make a difference.
I went out to a major intersection on the border of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. This was the day that Congress authorized the president to do Desert Storm. I had to get arrested or do something because I didn't want to be part of the military in any capacity when the war broke out. These tanks and heavy-duty artillery and trucks were heading towards the front line, and with that Tiananmen Square incident in mind, I decided I'd hold up my hand and stop the traffic going towards the front line, which I did, and took off my uniform as a sign of resignation.
The power that each of us has in our own lives to think, to act, to choose what we believe and what we don't believe, this power, every time it's exercised, it is a hand grenade against the state.
Know about what the law is generally, who understand the Constitution and the rights that we have, an educated, intelligent, informed citizenry is the best bulwark against tyranny.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
You and I don't think we're wasting our time trying to make a movie, to try and mobilize inattentive citizens to the dangers we're in and to their delicts as citizens.
I would make people accept personal moral responsibility for their actions.
There are times in world history when it is far wiser to act than to hesitate. There is some risk involved in action, there always is. But there is far more risk in failure to act.
Never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. What will you do?